I'm Jeremy Crawford. I oversee development and editing for Dungeons & Dragons at Wizards of the Coast, and I am joined by three fantastic panelists this morning. We'll start with the DM to the stars on my right, Chris Perkins. Chris, please tell them what you do at Wizards.
I'm the senior producer at Wizards of the Coast, so my job is basically to corral products and freelancers and make sure that everything comes out on time and does exactly what we intend it to do.
To my left is someone you might have heard of, Mike Merles. Mike, what do you do at Wizards of the Coast?
I'm the senior manager, which basically means I coordinate our efforts for RPGs, board games, digital games, everything gaming related to D&D, and then also everything story related like the novels. So.
He's the boss. And on Mike's left, James Wyatt.
I'm James Wyatt. I'm creative manager, sort of, for D&D. The story part of I don't know what my job title is anymore.
Is your job like
he fights crime by night?
Actually,
yes.
James's real job is he's always available to play foosball. So that's
Wow. So the story part of Mike's job falls under my responsibility. I deal with story in novels, in adventures, in settings, in digital games. We work a lot with our digital games team, primarily in licensing right now.
James is also a fantastic writer, and how do you often refer to yourself when I come to you?
Writing monkey, give me words.
Yes. Often when I need text filled in, I wander over to James' desk and say, please, write this.
And I love it.
Yes. So this morning we are here to obviously talk about the DM side of D&D Next. But before we dive into the various interesting things that we'll be discussing this morning, Chris has a D&D adventure trivia question, and the correct answer to which will result in a prize.
Yes. I've got here with me a collection of shrink-wrapped original TSR-produced adventure modules from the golden days. So, if you know the answer to the following trivia question, raise your hand. Kevin Culp, aka Pirate Cat, mentioned this adventure in Thursday's keynote but got the title incorrect. What is the adventure? Oh, shame. Yes, sir.
In Search of the Unknown.
You are correct, sir. This is yours.
In Search of Adventure, I think.
that was the compilation title, yeah.
Oh yeah, that was that fairly thick volume later.
D1 through 9.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there will be more of those throughout the panel. So Mike, would you please kick us off and just talk about the general vision for D&D Next, which we've done in several panels, not only here and at other conventions, but focusing this time on the DM side of things.
So what we want to do with the DM side of things is take a lot of cues from 4th edition, especially with regards to the mechanics and how DMs interact with the mechanics. So one of the things I'm really happy that we did with 4E was we made the rules very transparent for DMs to understand. We were pretty upfront with if you want to make a monster, it's really simple, right? We just give you some really basic, straightforward math. You just pick the monster's level and its role, and you basically have its core stat block, and you can kind of focus on building its special abilities. Things like XP progressions, encounter building, even with the treasure system, it was very straightforward of here is what we expect you to have for magic items, and here's the sort of schedule by which you should get them. The big change, though, is I think where 4E had some issues was things were very structured. The structure was transparent, but it was also very comprehensive in a way. There was a lot of like, you must do this by this level or things might not work. So we're kind of taking away a lot of those requirements. So while we can be pretty transparent about treasure, in play as a DM, you can say, well, I want to run a very low magic campaign. So there are no magic items. Or if there are magic items, they're just very, they're wondrous things like a cloak that lets you fly or boots that let you move silently. It isn't like the players must find a +1 longsword, by 5th level, or the math is wrong, things like that. So in a lot of ways, we're preserving that transparency, but we're removing a lot of the dependence on the system for DMs to take specific certain actions for the game to function properly, within the math. So that's kind of like the big picture overview. In terms of adventure design, we're looking more at the adventure as the kind of unit that you build. You know, you think, I'm going to build an adventure, and how do I want to do that? Encounter design is part of that, but it's only really as much of that as you want it to be. In terms of if you want to build very elaborate set-piece encounters for combat, or if you want to think of it in terms of, well, okay, easy fight, harder fight, boss fight. We really want DMs to be able to have a lot of flexibility in how they want to structure things. But starting with the adventure as the main, like if you're a DM, you're going to sit down and you think, hey, I have a session on Tuesday night. What do I want to do? You can think of it in terms of, well, I'm going to run an adventure. And in this adventure, it's almost like thinking like if you're going to write a script for a TV show, or, I mean, depending on how you approach it, that's kind of how I think of it. But it's, you know, if it's episodic, you're just thinking, okay, in this session, the players might go this way or that way, so I might need to stat up a few combat encounters for the orc layer outside of town, and I might want to think about what's going on over here. You know, creating a system that is very flexible so that as a DM, you can take whatever sort of creative approach you take to creating adventures, and then our system is ready to support it. So again, getting rid of a lot of that structure in terms of it dictating what DMs have to do, but keeping that transparency so you can understand when you're doing something, the game makes sense, you understand why the rules are working the way they are, and you also understand how you can change the rules and how you can modify things. So
we've talked a lot about giving agency back to the DM.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of adjudicating rules as well as adventure design and that sort of thing. I made a big deal in the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide about saying, you know, you don't have to be a rules expert. You can delegate that responsibility to somebody else at the table, basically trying to encourage people to feel willing to take on the job of being a DM. But we're going at it in this edition, I think, by making the rules a lot simpler and,
yeah, exactly.
and resting more on the DM's shoulders, but it's a lighter weight.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I think if as a DM you feel like, oh, I need a rules expert to run the rules, and we've probably screwed up, because you're kind of telling us you want a game that doesn't have a lot of rules, and we're forcing you to have like what I really want is like the baseline of here are enough rules for the game to be functional, like you can play a game, to be fairly low, so you don't feel that you have to learn all this stuff. That a lot of that stuff is going to be pushed away into the optional rules. That if as a DM you want that level of, you know, precise rules wording or very specific things that cover all these corner cases, you can choose to use that. And if you feel comfortable, like, well, I want someone at my table running that, or, you know, a rules caddy or whatever it is, you can do that, but we don't want you to feel like you have to do that. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, and that's sort of this clumsy, like, 10 a.m. at Gen Con on Friday sort of way, which is, oh, it's only Friday, right? I'm already,
He's actually a zombie.
Yeah, exactly, right? Well, it's like the keynote was like the thing, so now that's done. I'm like, I'm done. I'm ready to go take a nap. But yeah, so really making it feel like as a GM, you can kind of think of it. You know, I talked at the keynote last night about, like, you know, the rules are almost like the set of paints we provide, and the DM's going to make a painting, and the painting is the important thing, not the paints. And so really focusing on that, letting you kind of choose your palette and go really simple and minimalist if that's what you want. Add in more things that, you know, add more detail if that's what you want, and then make your game about anything from, we just go into a dungeon and kill stuff and take its treasure, to, well, my characters are traveling pie salesmen who regularly, you know, get into pie fights with the competing gnome pie guild, right? Like, that's, why not, right?
Yeah,
D&D lets you do that, so why not let you do that? So
I think the skill system is a really good example of that, and I bet Jeremy could say lots of good things about that.
Yeah, that was just something we talked a bit about in the Creating the Core panel yesterday, and it's something we'll touch on again tomorrow when we repeat that panel. So if for any of you who missed that one yesterday, come again tomorrow. As Mike was saying, our goal is for the core rules of the game to be super lean, and one of the main reasons for that is so that the DM can improvise with confidence. That if a DM has decided not to layer in all of the more complex rules options, he or she will still have enough to create the stories and adjudicate the combat encounters and social interactions and other sorts of exploration encounters that he or she desires, and can do it again confidently, using really just a small set of very solid rules. So the skill system that James mentioned is an optional part of the game currently, and it's extremely simple. If you take a look at our packet that we released earlier this week, you'll notice that the skills themselves contain no rules inside them. For, if you have, tightrope walking as a skill, the skill describes the circumstances in which a character might use that skill, but it has no resolution mechanics in it. And this is a huge difference from the skill systems we've had in the previous 2 editions, where essentially the skill system was the resolution system for the game. Because if you think back at your 3rd and 4th edition experience, almost everything that your characters do, or when you're DMing, often your monsters, if they're doing something other than attacking or casting a spell, is mediated through the skill system. They're making climb checks or athletics checks, perception checks, etc. We are very consciously moving into an environment where if a DM wishes, a DM only ever has to worry about making checks with the 6 ability scores that have been in Dungeons & Dragons since the 70s. The DM never has to worry about skills because the skills just represent areas of extreme expertise. And our rule is simple. If a person has a skill and they make an ability check related to that area of expertise, they get to add in the bonus that their expertise gives them. That's it. And that's the kind of leanness that we're talking about, that will not only aid players, but also make it so much easier for DMs to wing it. Because again, if the DM wants, the DM can just go to the table and have sort of in their mind a list of, well, this is in general the sort of thing I'll assign to intelligence checks, these other things will be charisma checks, these other things will be constitution checks. And right there, you have most of what you need to adjudicate most exploration encounters and most social interactions. And then the combat rules handle combat. A lot of this work that we're doing, as Mike and James have talked about, is about giving the DM more agency. DMs have always had tons of agency in every edition of the game, but it is something we're very consciously embracing in our work, that Dungeon Masters are our partners, that at the end of the day, it is you as DMs who are creating the D&D experience with your players at the game table, not us. We're certainly doing it with our players when we're DMing, and we can give you all sorts of fantastic tools in our products to aid you as DMs, but it is you as storyteller, as rules adjudicator, as adventure designer, as world creator, as birther of gods. You are the one who is creating the Dungeons & Dragons experience at your table. And so we take that very seriously in how we're approaching the DM side of things, that we need to do everything we can to empower you to do that ably and simply, and for us to take as much of the homework as we can out of DMing. We want it to be a pleasure for you. This is one way, and here I'll segue into magic items. We touched on it briefly.
I think Chris had something to add.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, how many of you are currently actively a DM? Good stuff.
Thank
Great.
you.
Yes.
We love you.
Yeah, our job, our existence hinges on making your lives easier. So, and I think in the past several editions of the game, we have seen efforts taken to make the DM's job easier. I know when I was working on my 3rd edition campaign, it required a lot more effort on my part in my 4th edition campaign, and I want my next campaign to require a lot more effort than my 4th edition campaign does. And so that's sort of one of the things I keep in the back of my head is how much prep time does a DM have to do to really make their game rock, their player's world? Mm-hmm. And before you jump into magic items, another trivia question. What's the name of the adventure that inspired the Savage Tide adventure path? Yes, sir. You got it.
Magic items. I mentioned wanting to take some of the homework out of the game. As many advances as there were in 4th edition for the Dungeon Master. I mean, I know for myself, having DM'd every edition of the game, 4th edition in some ways had the best tools for me as a DM in terms of making my life fairly easy in comparison. The one area that has always sort of jabbed at me as a DM in the last 5 years is magic items. And this is, when I think of homework This is what I'm usually thinking of. And the reason for that is we all know that because of the math in the past edition, and this was actually true behind the scenes in third as well, unless characters had particular enhancement bonuses at particular levels, they were falling behind the math curve. And so there became this sense of entitlement about magic items. And so a thing that should really feel wondrous and truly like a reward became an entitlement on the player side and an obligation on the DM side. Hence my referring to it as homework. It is the piece in my preparation where I always feel, okay, now here's the part I have to do to serve the system. And our philosophy for the DM is the system should always be serving the dungeon master, not the other way around. And so our vision for magic items is to make them wondrous and, as Mike mentioned, optional. You could have a game where half the party or no one in the party gets a magic item and the system will function. We have built the underlying math of the game so that it will work without the introduction of magic items. There will be consequences, and we'll make those consequences very clear to the dungeon master, but there is no sort of catching up that player characters will have to do through the acquisition of magic items. As Mike mentioned too about the wings of flying and that sort of thing, or cloak of invisibility, we want our magic items to have vivid and easy to grok effects, and that will be often character defining, rather than, again, sort of serving the math. Anything you guys want to add about magic items?
Let's see.
We'll have them
As a
soon.
DM, sorry. Go ahead,
I
Judge.
said we'll have them soon.
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
As a DM, I don't want to have to deal with issues of the 25th level characters going out and trying to find a place to buy a 1,125,000 gold piece magic item, and just the nonsensical world that has to sort of unfold to make that happen. Figuring out ways to build magic items that don't become this linchpin of the D&D economy, and one magic item could literally bankrupt an entire nation.
Yes. Yeah. The economy is on our long list of things to address in the next edition, so that it is a bit more sensible. And as a part of that project, we are no longer assuming that player characters can readily make magic items. Magic items, again, will largely be the domain of the dungeon master. Now, the dungeon master, being the narrator for his or her campaign, will certainly have the option to create a campaign setting where magic items are plentiful and where people can walk into a shop and buy them and people can craft them. That simply won't be the default assumption for the game. The default assumption will be, these are items of ancient eras that must be found and must be earned on adventures, with some minor exceptions. Things like healing potions that apothecaries have retained the knowledge for creating, and other minor magic that characters like wizards might be able to craft.
Another
Yeah.
quick trivia question?
Sure, go for it.
Thank you.
Give away free stuff is cool.
Woo. This adventure, en français Château d'Amberville, was inspired by the Averone stories of Clark Ashton Smith. There you go. Castle Amber was always one of my favorites because it had this crazy loco family that were all just holed up in this mansion for no particular reason. All out to kill each other, but somehow never finding each other in the rooms. I don't know. It was awesome.
So I want to throw in one more thing about magic items. So with the assumption being that DMs have a lot of control over magic items, and then you can let players buy and sell them if you want and all that stuff. It lets us design the items without worrying about accidentally breaking your game, because the item will only show up if you as a DM decide to give it to a player. So something like Wings of Flying, we can just say, Wings of Flying, let you fly. Done, period. Because we don't have to worry about, well, maybe it's only for like 1 round per fight or something like that. Like what?
These wings suck. Who made this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So just because the thing is that just makes the item more sensible in the world. Like, yeah, who would make wings that don't actually work,
right?
And spend 1.25 million gold pieces on them? But because we know as DMs, we're letting you opt into this or opt out of it or do with it as you will. And no matter what we try to do with the magic item system, like there's always a chance a thing could go wrong in your campaign. Right, and we'd rather just be upfront with DMs and give good advice of, well, if an item isn't working out, if you thought this would happen and you added it and now this is happening instead, we'd rather just give you guys good advice on how
to take it away.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's old school.
That's part of the fun, right? Because I think no matter what, again, this is going to come up no matter what, right? We've seen it happen in every edition of the game, and trying to worry too much about what could go wrong leads us to doing fairly timid design. If instead, I'd much rather have us focus on what would be exciting, what would be interesting, instead of worrying all the time.
It's a really funny example of the whole idea of giving agency back to the DM and the fact that we are not the designers of your game, in effect. On the one hand, giving the DM advice about how to take away a magic item that has overpowered your game. On the other hand, errata.
And we would much rather give you advice.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about monsters. In the latest in the latest packet, you will see a new stat block format, and since the first playtest packet, the monsters have undergone quite a few changes. They have new abilities. Their numbers are different. You'll notice that a number of the monsters share abilities. This is a direction we're going in with our monster design. So you'll notice, for instance, several monsters who have an ability called Mob Tactics, and if you read it, it actually does the same thing. This is an approach we're taking. It's different from what we've done in the last 5 years, where, like, if you look at 5 monsters from 4th edition, they each might have a power with the exact same name, and none of those powers do the same thing.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, or you might, yeah, exactly. And this time around, if two monsters have abilities with the same name, those abilities do the same thing. And this is an example of the kind of thing we're doing to make your life easier as a DM. Because we want you, once you've mastered Mob Tactics, to be able to go to a new monster and see, oh, I know what this ability does. I don't even need to read it. I've already run these other monsters that have this ability 10 times. I'm good to go.
And never once did you have to go to a glossary in the back of the monster manual to look it up, because it's there in the stat block.
Right. I mean, that's something that we have taken to heart from our 4th edition stat blocks, is that it is so valuable for DMs to have all the information there at their fingertips for running a monster. So that's not something that we're going to back away from. I mean, it's something we all enjoy as DMs, and we will continue it. Now, we might at some point do a condensed stat block in an adventure somewhere where you might need to go to a glossary, but that certainly would not be our default for presenting a monster, say in a product like a monster manual. Also, right now, we have a large story project going on having to do with monsters. And James, would you please tell us a bit about that project?
Sure. So a couple times a week currently, Mike and Matt Cernett and one of our art directors, Dan Jellin, and I are sitting down in a little conference room and just going through some of the most iconic monsters of D&D. And I always bring 4 monster manuals to that meeting. We lay out the page for a specific monster from every edition and talk about what it is, what it does, what it looks like, what its habits are, to make sure that we're finding kind of the consensus in every edition, and to make sure that, if you like the 4th edition Cyclopses that are slaves of the Fomorians, you can still do that, even if that's not the default direction that we're presenting. So the results of those meetings are showing up on the column I've been writing for the D&D website, which I need to write like 3 of them on the plane home. Wandering Monsters comes out on Wednesdays?
It comes out on Tuesdays.
Tuesdays. Shows how much attention I'm paying. Where basically I've been trying to take a compare and contrast approach. Orcs and gnolls have a lot of similarities. They're both these chaotic, rampaging humanoids. What's the same about them? What's different about them? And that's an area where we really want your feedback. I've been asking at the end, does this look like an orc to you? And that's feedback that we're taking seriously and making sure that we're presenting orcs as you guys think of orcs as being. But then the end result of that, we want to build our own internal guides that are probably going to look a lot like monster manuals that say, here's what orcs are, and whatever expression of D&D you're engaging with, whether it's a digital game or a novel or a board game or the D&D RPG, you're going to recognize the orcs that you see there. Of course, as a DM, you are free to completely ignore that information. And say, no, actually, orcs in my world are seafaring pirates, and they're very sophisticated. Actually, they're Odonti, is that what it was? Farming orcs who are very nice and pleasant, if you want to.
I said al dente.
They're delicious with the marinara sauce.
If you've been practicing your D&D Next. If you've been basically running a D&D Next mini campaign using the playtest documents that are out there, you may have noticed, or you might start to notice as we release more materials and characters start to get higher level, that you don't need to create a bunch of orcs of different levels like you do in 4th edition. The orcs that we create will remain valid antagonists throughout adventurers' careers. You don't have to, as a DM, explain, well, why does this island have level 10 orcs running around? And what happened to all the level 1 orcs in the world? Did they just all die off in the past, 4 days? Because, a typical campaign go from level 1 to 30 in 3 weeks, right? At least in mine. So it's very interesting to me, and I'm looking forward to creating sort of the definitive versions of different monsters and not have to just artificially scale them up and then explain why are these 29th level orcs just showing up now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this touches on something that we talked about in the Creating the Core panel yesterday, and that is, in the system, we are reining in number inflation. And one of the reasons we're doing this is so that, as Chris says, you can have an orc just be an orc, and you can keep using orcs as long as you want to in a campaign. And largely it's just going to mean as the heroes get higher level, they're just going to be more orcs. But the orc...
30 to 300.
Yes, right. And there are 2 main reasons why we're taking this approach. One, again, is to make the DM's life easier. It means that once you have mastered the orc, the hobgoblin, the goblin, the gnoll, etc., 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 you've got it. And you can go back to that monster and reuse it and not suddenly have the Axe Crasher, Myrmidon, Orc Face, who's 21st level and has a series of abilities that you have to relearn because they may or may not have any relationship to just the orc that you used 20 levels ago. And also, this touches on something else that Chris said. We're doing this for world-building reasons. So much of our approach for our DM material going forward, going back to this idea of giving the Dungeon Master agency, is giving the DM great tools for creating adventures and worlds. And as a part of that effort, we want to make sure we aren't putting things into the game that basically plant these landmines of absurdity into your campaign settings, where suddenly, you're basically hoping no one asks the question of where were these 29th level orcs and why haven't they wiped out all life on the planet? Because really they are powerful enough that they could go into the villages that were at the beginning of your campaign and kill everybody, and probably do it in a matter of 1 or 2 rounds. So again, we don't want absurdity bombs waiting for you as a DM. We want you to be able to build worlds and build them confidently.
Monster-related trivia question for another adventure. This adventure gave birth to the Yuan-Ti. Yes, sir, in blue. No, sir, but good guess and good adventure. And the fellow behind you? You are correct, sir.
My favorite.
Well done.
I love that adventure.
Oh, but I hate snakes.
I love snakes.
You hate snakes?
Oh,
That's
yeah.
like the other thing you have in common with Indiana Jones. The other one being that you recovered the Ark of the Covenant.
That's right. Yeah, little known fact, I have the Ark of the Covenant at my desk at Wizards of the Coast.
It's like a coffee table. It's great. Just don't touch it. The ghost will not kill you. It's like a prank we do in the new guys. Like, hey, touch the Ark. Touch the Ark. Oh, don't touch the Ark.
Every D&D book, when I'm reviewing the galleys for it, I lay them upon the Ark of the Covenant.
So I want to get back to real quickly something that Jeremy mentioned too about thinking about monsters in context of the world, right? The world of D&D. You know, if you look at the current playtest packet, when we were working on the stats for the monsters, a lot of it was thinking, you know, whatever the monster is, like attack the village or was fighting the town guardsman, what would happen, right? So you can kind of picture, okay, if there's an orc with a great axe, with one hack, he could take down, you know, a first level fighter, right? Like a warrior, like in Chainmail the Shield and Sword, who's defending the town. That orc could take him out in one blow, and it maybe a little bit of a lucky blow, but we know orcs are kind of big, tough, powerful guys with big weapons. That would make sense in the story, right? If you're watching a D&D movie or reading a D&D novel, as opposed to say a group of goblins, where you think, okay, one goblin against the town guardsman, the town guardsman can beat the goblin. There needs to be like maybe 2 or 3 goblins who gang up on him, and then we start thinking, well, how does that fight play out? You know, the goblins are kind of shifty and they're kind of cowardly, but if they can outnumber you or ambush you or stab you in the back, that's when they're really dangerous. Or things like kobolds, where if you can imagine the kobolds attack the village, it's just this swarm of like lemming-like kobolds just charging in. And there might be a smart kobold in the back who's kind of kicking them in the butt to get them to go in, but the kobolds defeat the town, this poor town guardsman who keeps getting killed by a series of monsters by, you know, like jumping on top of him. There's 3 or 4 kobolds who pull him down or just bashing with clubs, or, you know, or maybe the kobolds are using their slings or short bows, and they're pretty deadly if they're skirmishing, but once you get up close to them, they just flee.
Or they lure you out into the woods and drop you in a pit.
Yeah, exactly.
And
or ambush
drop
you.
scorpions down on top of you.
Yeah, exactly. But you can kind of think then it starts telling us a little bit of the story of the world. Like, do the kobolds attack the village? No, probably not, unless there's like some evil force behind it. The kobolds are probably more likely to sneak into the village and maybe steal things if they want to mess with the humans or whatever. They're not really likely to attack because their tactics are a little more passive. They're more, let's lure the guy into the trap. Let's, you know, use slings or ranged weapons and scatter when someone gets close. We kind of do this horde tactic thing only if we kind of have to. Same with goblins, right? And you kind of start seeing now this sort of ecology starts to build. It's almost like the ecology of the Caves of Chaos, right? If you had this, you know, dungeon apartment complex with all these monsters living in, how would they get along? Or who's the loud neighbor? Who's the guy who's always calling people like, turn down the music, or complaining, you know, the recycling hasn't been taken out yet, right?
And who enforces the noise? Is it the ogre or the minotaur?
Right. Yeah, it's probably the ogres. Well, you're never paying him, right? The ogre shows up, and if you give the ogre money, he lets you keep your stereo on. But there are even things like that, and how we're thinking about it. You know, and in the last playtest packet, we actually went back and scorched all the flavor text, just because we were kind of thinking, well.
In the monsters.
Yeah, in the monsters. Yeah, just entirely, right? It's all just math. No,
yeah.
In the monster descriptions. Because we just realized we don't really have this stuff completely settled yet, so we'd rather just kind of remain silent, because we assume most people who've been playing Dungeons & Dragons know what an ogre is, so we don't feel the need to tell you again. And what we want at the end of the day, when we do have that text ready and we're ready to share with you, it's something that like, you know, James has mentioned, it rings true, right? You're not like, oh, I never knew that about it. Like, that's weird, right? That's unexpected. It's more like, oh, like, if it's unexpected, it's more the thing of, oh, I never put those 2 dots together, but that actually makes a lot of sense. Oh yeah, that's how ogres would work, right? Okay, yeah, you know, like, they can be bribed, they're kind of lazy, or things like that. Or what's really exciting, because we were just talking about giants a couple weeks ago. You know, there's this book called Giant Craft that came out during 2nd edition that talked about giants. And so these kind of funny little things that come up. For instance, it talks about hill giants, and for each giant, it kind of says, here's the thing these giants value. And for hill giants, it was eating contests. which seems kind of funny, but then you're like, well, that kind of explains why hill giants go and raid villages. Like, they want food, right? They're hungry all the time. They like to eat. They're these big gluttons. So, when the hill giants attack the village, and there's our first level fighter human guard who's all, crying, it's giants this time, I'm dead. The hill giants actually ignore him, right? They're busy picking up cows or, smashing and, trying to raid the tavern to get, the kegs of ale. They'd actually rather not fight the guy, right? They're just kind of like these sort of like dim-witted, chaotic evil frat boys, right? They'd rather not fight you. They're just here for, the food and the beer, right? But, that kind of thing where we can kind of start putting that flavor more into the monsters and into our adventures, into the settings where, okay, yeah, these guys are a little more distinct. They're a little more interesting. But it's all stuff that's been there, right? Like, Giantcraft was published like 20 years ago. It's not like we're just making all this stuff up from scratch. So we're just kind of going back and finding that lore and bringing it to the forefront.
We've gotten a lot of feedback that most of you like the second edition Monstrous Compendium and Monstrous Manual as a guideline for what a monster entry should look like, with a paragraph or two about combat, and then 3 or 4 paragraphs, 5 or 6 paragraphs about habitat, society, ecology, how these monsters fit into the world. So that's the direction we're gazing at right now.
And that's something interesting too. I'm sorry if I interrupt the applause. I love it. But we've been talking about that in terms of presentation. If you think of a monster, say like an ogre mage, who might have a couple like tricks up his sleeves, like change self or some illusion abilities, whatever. When we present monsters, we want to be aware of if a monster has a lot of non-combat magical abilities. If we're giving you a stat block in an adventure where we think you're going to fight this guy, like maybe we don't put those in there just in terms of saving space and brevity and DM focus, like when you're running that encounter at the table. But that might be like in the monster manual where we're presenting them. We might have an entire extra like stat block or presentation of like non-combat abilities. Like the djinn that can give you wishes, right? Like he doesn't use that when he fights you, but if you're, that might be under a social header or an interaction header. You can imagine combat, interaction, exploration all being parts of that. So the green slime is actually not a really interesting monster to fight. It's actually scarier when you're exploring because you might, it might drop on you while you're poking your way down the passage in a dungeon, or you might accidentally find it by sticking your hand in a clay pot the kobolds had. Oh, that's full of green slime. Oops, right? And I liked having 2 hands, but I missed that I had 30 seconds ago before I stuck my hand in here. But that kind of lets us, when we think of monsters, now we're not just thinking, not all the monsters, kind of like I was describing before, charge into the village to attack our hapless first level fighter town guardsman. Some of them talk to it. Some of them show up to trade, right? Some of them are just lurking off in the dungeon. The yellow mold doesn't hate anyone. It just gets it just shoots spores when you get close to it. It's not personal, right?
It is seething with rage.
Yeah, it's over a to whom it may concern attack, right?
It needs a hug.
Yeah. But just things like that, or like the Shrieker, right? You don't fight Shriekers. Shriekers just make noise, right? Because that's just part of the dungeon ecology. But we can still present that as a creature in the world of D&D, but we're no longer just thinking of, maybe the creature has like sound burst or sonic powers or can fly, right? We're not trying to make these things into just combat pieces where they are denizens of a fantasy world.
Yeah, they're world-building pieces.
Exactly.
And certainly many of them will be participants in battles, but many of them will be there for role-playing encounters, as Mike is suggesting, and exploration encounters. What this means is you won't see it in the near term, but long term, expect to see the return of quite a few good aligned creatures.
Oh, yeah.
In the previous edition, a lot of good aligned creatures sort of taken a back seat at the very, very back of the bus, with even some classic good creatures like the metallic dragons suddenly not being good anymore. You're going to see the return again of a lot of good creatures, because again, our philosophy is a monster manual shouldn't be filled with just combatants. It is also filled with just the denizens of your world, and that means many creatures that are there not to fight you, but to aid you, to talk with you. Sometimes
give you riddles.
To give you riddles. Sometimes they will even fight you if you end up at odds with them, because they're
Or fail to answer their riddles.
yes, yeah. I mean, I certainly have had campaigns where good heroes and good creatures are fighting against each other because they have different political aims. They're members of different factions. So there certainly is a place for such things in our worlds.
It's actually been pretty fun when we've talked about good creatures like the good giants, good dragons and things. To think of like, well, in the world of D&D, if you have these really powerful, good aligned creatures, like why are they sitting on their asses all the time? Like, there's a lot of like bad stuff going on. This poor first level town guardsman keeps getting murdered by goblins, and the gold dragon is just kind of, I got better things to do, right? And so it's been kind of fun to think, well, what is actually the reason? Why would that happen, right? And it's, it's actually kind of inspiring to think like, well, what is the mindset of like the powerful storm giant lord who's like this chaotic good guy, but maybe he's kind of off like on his mountaintop eyrie, and he doesn't. Like, he might be a really nice guy, but he might just kind of have, like, a non-interventionist attitude toward the rest of the world or whatever, right? Just this idea that there might be these powerful good figures, but how can we make them so that they are interesting, and especially kind of hammer home that idea of this guy really is an interaction encounter, because maybe he is the guy who can conjure up the storm that can, just smash the pirate fleet that's going to attack that.
Yeah, but he'd rather spend all day on the internet.
She has me.
He's got a blog.
Yeah. But that might be.
Cloud giants suck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make Gold Dragon friends on his Facebook page.
Now, go ahead.
So, but that may be something where, like, in that monster entry, like, the first thing we might show you might just be, like, this is why cloud giants are the way they are, and it's actually, these are, like, there is a combat section, but that might be the last thing we show you, because we don't really expect you're going to fight these guys. You're probably more likely to be going to them and saying, hey, we need help, what do we need to do? And when we write the monster, we'll have that thing in mind, right? We're going to think about this creature, think about its story in terms of that, you might be going to it for help, and how do the storm giants think of humans and humanoids and like the lesser races and other monsters and creatures, and really create that as a fabric of the world.
Yeah, they're just a fad.
And a big piece to how we approach like, good aligned creatures like the gold dragon, the storm giant, but even many of our evil creatures is to take note of the frequency notes in early editions of the game. And also to return to myth and folklore when we consider a monster's place in the world. I say this because in the last 10 years, there's been this, I often refer to it as the science fictionization of Dungeons and Dragons, where suddenly every monster turns into a species. Like instead of there being the Medusa, a woman who was cursed, suddenly there is the race of Medusas, a la the Bajorans from Star Trek or some other science fiction genre. Now, we will still give you the option as a DM to do that sort of thing, but for many of these creatures, our default assumption will be there is the Medusa, or there is probably in a typical setting a storm giant. In your world there might be 2 gold dragons in the whole world, or maybe in your world there's a whole flight of them. But again,
if you can rouse them from their slumber.
Yeah, exactly. We will take very seriously that there are consequences if we suddenly give the impression that the default D&D world is overrun by countless numbers of all of these creatures, which again turns into one of those absurdity bombs that I was referring to earlier. Again, as a DM, you can do whatever you want. You could decide, I want minotaurs to be as numerous in my world as dwarves.
Yeah.
Awesome, do it. That's probably not going to be our assumption.
Yeah. Well, and that's really good. We were talking about those guys, with the myth of the Minotaur being, like the big burly monster in the Labyrinth, whatever, in Crete and all that stuff, and we also introduce them as a race, in part inspired by Dragonlance. And that might be something where when we present them as monsters, we're pretty clear, okay, the Minotaur is the big giant monster in the Labyrinth, and here's the story behind that. And so when you first encounter Minotaur in D&D, it might be in a labyrinth, and it might be tied to Baphomet, and the idea of being a Minotaur is maybe a curse, or it might even be a gift from Baphomet to his followers and things like that. But then we also have Minotaurs as player characters, because in Dragonlance, you have the Imperial whatever the Imperial League is, whatever it's called, Enceladus, right? And it's Minotaurs with this Roman feel, and we can be pretty upfront about saying Minotaurs in a vacuum are these mythological creatures, labyrinths tied to Baphomet, all this stuff. And Minotaurs as player characters, here's an example of, from Dragonlance, how that might work, right? Instead of trying to say, oh, in all settings now you can be a Minotaur fighter, we can say, well, here's how Dragonlance handled that, and in this world, here's what it looks like. Now, those game mechanics are there for you to use. If you wanted to include that as a player character race, you just dupe those stats over and tell players, hey, you can play the Talidus Minotaur, and that is a playable Minotaur. But we're not trying to say in all D&D settings, oh, in Greyhawk now we have to account for that, or in the realms and things like that. We can be truer to something, and I think it's probably more useful, and this, from my experience, it's more useful for me as a DM if I see these, like a potential player character race, not just as, oh, it's a monster that you can just play, but it's given a context. I can say, oh, it's kind of cool to have like Roman-themed, this culture, this imperial culture that's kind of on this other continent. Or, I'm going to just take those numbers and make up my own story for it. But again, giving DMs those options and not trying to put everything, make everything core. And have, okay, now everything has to play together. How can we make sense of this? How can we have the big, burly Minotaur in the maze and also have, like, the heroic Minotaur paladin? Like, does that really make sense? And are we trying to kind of stretch the story in a way?
And the yak folk. We need the yak folk.
James really likes yak folk.
I love the Yakaria.
When we were walking, so we had this, when we had the meeting, we were talking about these guys, and you put yak folk on the board, and I was like, I don't think yak folk are on the list we created. Well, that's another thing, too. Like, I think when you look at D&D, D&D is full of crazy, weird monsters, and I think it'd be awesome to get his, I want to go through, I mean, we're kind of starting with, like, what are the top 100 monsters, but I would love to, like, have, like, and here are the top 1,000 monsters, at some point, but, eventually get to everything. That's going to take a long time, but we definitely, like, what makes D&D kind of cool and unique is there are all these weird critters that have been made over the years, and some of them are kind of cool and interesting, like, trying to think of a nifty new monster, like the Githyanki kind of rose up and became, that's kind of an iconic critter. Or are there any, like, newer creatures you guys can think of? Things that have risen to prominence over the... Because I keep thinking...
Yurthak, clearly.
Yeah,
no.
No, because this is the problem. I keep thinking of, like new monsters that were lame, like the Gambado and stuff, like, whatever. Like, it's D&D, like maybe the Gambado isn't the first monster we'll get to, but it's not like anyone else has cornered the market on Gambados. So.
Well, actually, a great example of a humanoid race that has risen to prominence is the Dragonborn.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Although, the Dragonborn have existed, at least visually, since first edition, where they were essentially the Draconians in Dragonlance, but now they've really captured a number of people's imaginations as a playable race.
Yeah.
And reinforcing what Mike said on the stage at the keynote last night, he informed me in no uncertain terms that we would be talking about the Flumph.
Yes. Well, the Flumps are the good example. It's not a monster you fight, it's a monster you laugh at. And it's lawful good for some reason, right? But getting back to something Jeremy mentioned, when you think of, like, things that have traditionally been kind of monsters or villains, like tieflings. Tieflings are players in player characters in Planescape, and Dragonborn. That's something where, again, we don't feel the need. We have to give this really long canonical thing about, Dragonborn are now in the Forgotten Realms, and they have these kingdoms and lands and realms. Like, we can be a lot more like, almost like a half-dragon, kind of like, well, maybe these guys are rare, like, or, come up with a story that makes them with self-contained, like the Minotaur has a nice self-contained story, and it can be as big in your world as you want or as small as you want. Now, obviously, in some of our published settings, things like, the Kender are part of Dragonlance, and if you're talking about Dragonlance and there's a Kender, you kind of know how they fit in. Or if you're talking about the Forgotten Realms and there's a Sun Elf versus a Moon Elf, they are part of that setting. But we're talking about D&D as a whole, like the kind of tools and the stuff, the building blocks of building your own campaign. I'd rather have these, like, self-contained stories that are kind of like these little Lego bricks that you can then put together, rather than try to tell you, like humans, we know, like, it's a weird D&D campaign setting that doesn't have humans as an important race. But otherwise, we don't want to assume anything and say, well, of course Dragonborn are in every city and every town, like, because we don't know that, right? That's up to you guys for your campaigns. So, but we'd like to have maybe something that's more of an interesting mythology around them that makes you go, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, again, these guys have, like, this kind of interesting self-contained story that maybe I want to use, maybe I don't, but they make sense within their own context, rather than trying to, like Jeremy referred to earlier, make everything to this race that you just found everywhere, and there are millions of them, and they have cities and all that stuff. kind of leaving that for you guys. Again, unless it's something that we know, super classic high fantasy stuff like elves, dwarves, halflings, which most people, most campaigns will have those features.
Sorry. I was just going to say, speaking of mythology and absurdity, I have another trivia question for you. This is a tough one. This adventure took place in the Duchy of Runa, where horses are ridden backward, dwarves are shaved and stretched to make them more palatable to their human neighbors, and taxes is collected in beer. It is also the only adventure from the TSR D&D days with a chimera on the cover. All right, I'll just leave that one out there. I totally didn't. I'm looking at it right here. Let me try a different one. Anybody ever play the old TSR Top Secret game? All right. Who designed it? Because he also wrote a D&D adventure for the expert set, module X6.
There's a hand back there.
Oh, yes, sir. No, but fine guess. Yes, sir. Sorry? It was not Len Lakofka, but another fine guess. Yes, sir? Not Skip Williams, but a great guy. All right, we'll just put that one aside. Any FR fans out there? All right. What is the war-torn region between Damara and Vasa called? There were several adventures, a series of 4 adventures based in that region. Yes, sir, you were the first. Yes, you are correct. Bloodstone Pass. For you, copy of the Bloodstone Wars. All right.
So a topic that we keep touching on, and it's something that we talked directly about in our panel yesterday, is this concept of what is core. And many of you know that within the past 5 years, our general approach has been if something is published for D&D, it's core. And that is no longer our approach. We will be actually quite upfront about what things we assume to be in a default D&D world, but beyond that, it is up to a setting, and it's up to you as DMs in the creation of your settings, what else is a core part of your worlds. So like right now when it comes to playable races, we are only assuming as the baseline humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings. And beyond that, again, it's up to setting and it's up to you as dungeon masters. Because we have found that going the other direction puts a tremendous amount of pressure and on our worlds, and also makes a lot of assumptions about the kinds of worlds you want to create. And so we think it is better to have sort of a leaner set of assumptions and let us, as we're building settings, and let you as DMs, when you're building your own settings, build on top of that lean foundation. So really, it's the same approach we're taking with the rules. We want a lean foundation with options that you can build on top of it. Same with story.
All right, how many people right now are using their smartphones to look for that adventure with the chimera on the cover?
You are correct, sir. Thank you, Internet. Is there anything you can't do?
I just looked out and noticed a surprising number of heads down like this. Wait, are we boring you? Oh, no.
I got another one for you. I have another adventure here, sort of a key background player in the adventure. She's known as the Sea Mother. That's the name of the adventure, but not the Sea Mother.
You said it.
Yes. Can you spell it? This is a good one because this is the original. Worth 60 gold pieces on eBay.
Which is like a lot of money. That's a lot of gold.
Very small pieces.
So on the topic of world building, let's talk briefly about cosmology. This is a topic near and dear to DM's hearts. We can't go into a lot of details now, but we can talk about our approach. James?
Okay, so the way I think about cosmology is there is nobody in the universe that can step back and look at all the planes. Every arrangement of planes that there is in any D&D rulebook is somebody's interpretation of how they all fit together. You can walk from Mount Celestia to Bitopia, but in order to do that, you've got to go through portals. So sure, maybe it seems like they're next to each other. Maybe they are, but nobody knows that. So I think it's perfectly possible for any cosmology you want to come up with, or any of the classic D&D cosmologies, to fit together, to be options that you can use in your game without really messing with anything. Is the elemental plane of fire a separate thing, or is it part of a larger churning chaos of elements? I don't know. And you can make a call on that, but fundamentally we can present fire elementals either way, without relying on one answer or the other. So Great Wheel or Astral Sea, it's up to you.
Yeah, and so what James is getting at is, even when it comes to cosmology, our approach is to give DMs the tools that they need to create the worlds and the cosmoses that they want to create. And so rather than us picking a particular version of the D&D cosmology and saying, this is it this time, we're going to say, here are an array of options. And again, we will make some default assumptions, and we will say, if you want to just have something pre-built for yourself and run with it, we will present the classic Great Wheel, but we will provide all sorts of suggestions for customizing that cosmology, ways to incorporate the Shadowfell, the Feywild, and other planar options that have appeared in products like Planescape, and in a variety of our worlds. Again, it is about giving you the tools to create the D&D experience that you want to create.
Yeah, because really what's important are the places rather than necessarily the connective tissue. So we'll talk about the plane of fire, but where you put the plane of fire is up to you. Now, and we'll have examples, right? Like obviously everyone knows the Great Wheel, things like that, and you can see, okay, this is how it's arranged. Or even something like in Planescape, where obviously the planes are a little important in Planescape. That might just, okay, this is how the planes work in Planescape, because Planescape is all about going to different planes and having these different locations and creating a cohesive setting that is really rich in that flavor and works for it. But then that lets us say, well, we don't necessarily have to take what Planescape says about the cosmology or how Planescape functions and say, well, and that's how Greyhawk works, right? Or that's how the Dragonlance planes work. Because you can get into Planescape from any setting we've ever published, right? Again, focusing on more of the destinations rather than the connective tissue. And obviously in our published worlds, we'd explain, okay, in the Forgotten Realms, this is how you get from plane to plane, because that is a feature of that setting. But letting DMs for your own campaigns come up with your own ways of handling that. If your campaign has a lot of planar travel or wars between planes, or the elemental planes are encroaching on the prime material world or your setting, things like that. What's really important just for you is like, okay, here's the plane of fire, and we can kind of describe it, and monsters can refer to it. But how those monsters travel about, how they interact with the world, that's up to you. So again, we want to be flexible with it. We want to kind of move away from being very canonical of here is the structure. Because again, that speaks more to the connective tissue, which I don't think is as important or compelling as those destinations, those locations, those names, Plane of Fire, the Nine Hells, the Abyss, things like that. That's the interesting part. The rest, in some ways, is just really determined by your campaign.